So we're going to start with like just a presentation and overview of the work to date. And then after that, I'll give you some guidance on how you can go about the room and look at some of the strategies and give us some feedback on them. But for now, we're just going to be looking at the screen and giving you kind of an update on vulnerability. If you hadn't intersected with any of that analysis before, we'll get you up to speed so that you can make some comments on these ideas. So as Dave said, this is a project focused on historic Sandwich Village, and we're looking at adaptation strategies to address flooding from coastal sea level rise and storm surge. So as I said, first we'll take the first part of the presentation of the session and talk about vulnerability and the analysis that we've done to date. We'll go over some of the resilience and adaptation strategies that we've begun to brainstorm, go over what this project is all about, which is kind of weaving together all of those strategies and figuring out the timelines that they might be effective. And then we'll break out into sort of the workshop phase where you'll be asked to sort of review all the individual strategies, provide some comments, give us some feedback if you have ideas that we haven't thought of yet. Anything is welcome. And we'll have a little question and answer before we break out. If you have questions about how these things are developed, if you have any questions about the climate change assessment in general, feel free to ask. And as I'm going through, you can stop me and I'll answer questions too if you have any clarifications. Then those three, there's 4 different areas that we've kind of developed strategies for. There's 3 stations in the adjacent room, and then there's 1 station in the back corner there. That's more about sort of regional strategies. After that, so we'll probably do 45 minutes or so of just kind of reviewing stuff, and then we'll have until 5 o'clock, or as long as you want to stay to kind of go around and check these things out. And then I'm going to stay afterwards if anybody else wants to discuss further, or in case anybody else drops in afterwards. So as Dave said, this is a state-funded grant project. It's funded through the Massachusetts Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness program. And they provide information, data, projections, and funding for communities to plan for climate change, sea level rise, storm surge being one, but also heat and precipitation as well. This started back in 2018. We had a planning workshop where we asked town staff and residents to think about climate change impacts and what their community strengths and vulnerabilities were, and sort of make a list of priority actions that the town could start addressing over time to build resilience in the community. The first thing that came out of that was a climate change vulnerability assessment for town assets, buildings, other facilities, generators, open space. And so we sort of looked at the flood risk, and you'll see a little bit more of this analysis that feeds into this project. And looked at how it would affect the town over time and started to think about adaptation strategies for those specific assets. After that, we sort of, we developed some outreach and engagement tools. So there's a website, there's a story map linked through the town's natural resources webpage. You can look at all of those assessments and the narratives along with them. There's some maps, and then we also Brittany developed a climate change curriculum with the Sandwich STEM Academy, so they can, 7th and 8th graders can investigate coastal vulnerability and resilience in their coursework. And that brings us to this project, which is, again, as Dave said, focused on historic Sandwich Village. It was one of the priority areas that came out of the MVP planning workshop, address flooding in the downtown area. And so we thought it was an appropriate place to start for adaptation planning. So that yellow line kind of delineates the area of concern, which is kind of the extent of potential long-term severe flooding in that region. So I'll just kind of scan through a couple photos here. Obviously, this area, the Cape Sandwich in general, is familiar with storm impacts. Here's River Street on a sunny day, and here it is in one of those 2018 storms. I believe this one was March, although it could have been January. So we get flooding coming up from Mill Creek and over the roadway, kind of overtopping the culvert in the road, impacting homes. 6A as well, by the fire station during that same storm, had some flooding that impacted fire and rescue operations. They had to stage their vehicles on either side of that flooded area. And Willow Street is another low-lying area. Also has a little culvert and depression on the backside of the road. And here it is during the March 2018 storm. Some of these may be a combination of precipitation and coastal flooding. Right now we're just looking at the coastal side of things, although precipitation is a concern going forward. So we have this historical record of storms. You know it well, having lived in Sandwich. There's a record at various tide gauges that are maintained by NOAA. The nearest sort of applicable tide gauge to us is the Boston one, and this shows the storm record for significant extreme water level events over time. You see those big peaks for this blizzard of 78, and then the January Grayson storm in 2018 actually was even more severe than that, became the storm of record. So this red line that you see across the top is the trend of the 1% chance event. So the annual probability, sort of the 1 in 100 year storm is sort of the common way of referring to that probability level. But it's the 1% chance on an annual basis of that level occurring. So we have a record of storms. We also have a record of sea level rise. This again is from the Boston tide gauge. Sea level, as we know, is rising. If you strike a straight line through it, you get a linear rate that's equal to almost a foot over 100 years. But if you start breaking this out into smaller increments, you can see those rates increasing over time. And that's what we call acceleration. It's due to thermal expansion as well as potential contributions from glaciers and ice sheet melt. So we have all this historical information. We need to look into the future in order to plan. And that's where the state and the MVP program come in. So they've developed these projections over a range of emissions scenarios. Greenhouse gas emissions contribute to climate change. They have developed projections between a medium emission scenario and a high emission scenario. And that kind of brackets a big range of possibilities, whether we act on greenhouse gases or not. Kind of boils down to that. And what we see on the right here is the latest sort of reality coming out of the last climate convention. And that blue band at the very top is the reality of what we're looking at. So we're seeing a peak, which is encouraging, but it's not the drastic reduction that we see on that green line down at the bottom. That's the Paris target. So we're somewhere in the middle as of now, which kind of, confirms that we're kind of planning for a reasonable range of possible futures. The state has also developed these sea level rise projections based on those emission scenarios. They are developed across a range of probabilities, and the state has identified this high scenario for planning purposes, because we don't want to be wrong in the wrong direction. We don't want to underpredict sea level rise when we're planning major infrastructure projects, right? So that blue line is the projected sea level, mean sea level, and the change is in the boxes from present. Those are associated with different probabilities, confidence intervals. So if you read some of the probabilities in that blue box there, that high scenario, we have very high confidence, either almost 100% if we're just talking about greenhouse gas emissions. and thermal expansion. Slightly lower confidence if we add in ice sheet melt. But what that's saying is we're pretty sure that it's not going to be worse than this. We're not under predicting sea level rise.
Any tipping points in here at all?
I'm sorry?
I thought that all the predictions, even high predictions, do not have any tipping points.
Tipping points being?
Like the Arctic tundra starts going.
It's kind of integrated. Yeah.
None of those are in.
It's integrated into the range of probabilities. So if you're talking about ice sheet melt, that's kind of where you're seeing the sort of shift in the slope of these curves. So those sea level rise projections are saying we think by this timeline it's not going to be any higher than this. So thinking about how that might play out locally, we mapped out those elevations for mean high water in Sandwich Village. And for the most part, the village is a basin with a salt marsh, and topography rises in some places pretty steep and quickly. In other places, that's not the case. So we have down by River Street, there's a floodplain area that does intersect some development over the long term. So that's sort of like a 2050, 2070 extent in that inset. Over by Willow Street, which is the other major low-lying area, it's kind of a similar situation. Looks like there's maybe an old creek that went up under that road. And so that potential sea level rise, tidal inundation case would be another long-term potential. There's a little bit kind of sneaking up behind the fire station and getting kind of starting to encroach on 6A, but the elevations don't really let that up onto the road. So that's sea level rise. So thinking about storms and sea level rise acting together, so more frequent and more intense storms over time, higher seas that are carrying those storms. We've looked at that using the Massachusetts Coast Flood Risk Model, which was developed for DOT to assess infrastructure impacts. And it takes into account those sea level rise projections, the landscape, more frequent, more intense storms, and runs all of the physical processes that affect where water goes. So over the various tidal cycles, looks at different wind patterns, wave setup, overtopping, and it primarily projects the probability of flooding wherever you are looking on the map. We can also get, again, that's annual probability. We can also look at flood depth, how long that inundation might stay on the landscape, and we can also back out information on waves and currents to inform design. So you've probably seen these either online or in various documents that we've prepared for other projects. This is probability of inundation from that flood risk model. The range goes from a very high intensity, low probability 0.1% storm in pink. That's like a 1,000-year recurrence interval, all the way up to the annual storm, 100% chance. That light green, just as a point of reference, is a 1% chance event, sort of like your 100-year storm into the future. So we'll just briefly click through these and see how that evolves. And so you'll see that extent increasing and the probabilities increasing over time as well. So we assess risk to infrastructure by taking the water levels at those different probability levels and seeing where they intersect the land or buildings. Maybe there's some foundation, first floor elevation, or some window that would impact a building. And we can see how That probability may change wherever you're looking. So each of those dots is looking directly down at that transect of land on the gray part of the graph. And you can see also there how the extent of flooding is increasing, the water levels are increasing, and the probability at any given point would increase over time. So that's what we did for Sandwich Village. We looked at those water levels over time for different parts of the road. So we broke up the road into fine segments and figured out what the elevation was. We figured out what the elevation was in different buildings within the study area. And we looked at those probabilities over time to sort of guide us into where the vulnerable spots would be. So this is a 2030 map. 2050, you get a lot of higher probabilities in those low-lying areas. And 2070, there's some areas that are going to be subject to like a 50 to 100% chance annual storm. To summarize all of that, kind of counted up the number of buildings and the miles of roadway that would be exposed to flooding in those different scenarios. Maybe we'll just focus on the 1% storm because that's kind of a familiar benchmark for people. That 1% storm would impact between 54 and 90 buildings over the course of those projections, and between 0.6 of a mile to almost 2 miles. And you think like 1% chance over a year, that's a pretty low probability, right? But if you play out the cumulative risk and the math on that, if you projected that out for a 10-year period, say, a 1% storm has a 10% chance of occurring over that time period. Some of those higher level storms, higher probability storms, less intense but more probable, they have much higher probabilities of occurring over a decade. If you think about that on the lifespan of a mortgage, say 30 years, those probabilities of a 1% chance event are quite high, upwards of, I think it's around 30% or maybe I think it's around 60% over the life of a mortgage for a 1% storm. We started looking at the first entry points for flooding, just to get a sense of whether there could be things we could do to address, not maybe the big one, but some of the lower level of storms that could, have more of a common impact on the town, and might be easier to maybe reduce that risk. So we see entry points in some of those low-lying areas, obviously, up onto 6A from both sides, Willow Street and in that corner by Jarvis Street. We see it on both sides of the fire station complex, as well as up from the western side of Brady's Island, and then a little bit of a spur that comes out going northwest on 6A. You'll also see sort of the ridge of the railroad tracks there, and that is potentially overtopped by not even an extreme storm. So we have all this flood risk, and we need to figure out what we can do about it, what's realistic to do, and what do those strategies look like. So there's two sort of main categories in terms of adaptation strategies here. You can do things on the building scale, and you can do things on the landscape scale. So some examples of things you can do on the building scale are elevating the building, and that can be either on pilings, like you see frequently near the water. You can elevate on fill if you can get it permitted. And you can also reprogram the lower levels of a building to accommodate flooding and have sort of the more critical uses above. You can do floodproofing, and these are measures to keep water out of various buildings. Wet floodproofing is something that's allowed for residential structures. Dry floodproofing is allowed for non-residential structures.
Could you describe what those are?
Yep. So wet floodproofing is allowing water to come into the building, usually into the basement. So you get all of your mechanical equipment out of the basement. You put in these, you'll see a vent right there. I don't have my mouse, but you see that little sort of gray smooth box that's in the middle of those planks? That's a little vent that allows water to flow through so that you don't have hydrostatic pressure compromising the structure of the building. So you allow it to equilibrate. You make sure that your lower levels are either you pump it out if it's a basement, or if it's a finished area, it's built with materials that can withstand and dry out.
What about a sand crawl space?
A sand crawl, so that you would, as long as the water isn't getting to your first floor, then yes, that would work. As long as you're allowing storm surge to pass under that space unobstructed.
What are you assuming about wastewater?
I'm sorry?
All these, there's septic fields everywhere.
That's the,
Well below the surface.
yep.
What are you assuming about wastewater?
These are mostly building focused, but
They have septic too.
we have septic too, that's true. So,
Assuming that everything's been plumbed up and there's a waste treatment plant and it's all pumped out before any of this starts?
no, but as you have like a storm surge, that'll come and go, right? There may be some minor impacts to the field.
Gotta let everybody's septic fields and their tanks and everything, and it's just all gonna be out, and then it'll go away.
The storm will recede and they'll recover. Sea level rise is a different issue because you'll have that, more frequent flooding, and maybe even a permanent state, in which case you have to do something that's not a septic tank. You'd have to have like a tight tank.
Receiving water.
Right.
Sitting on
Right.
It's flooded out, you're hauling your wastewater.
Right. So that is another consideration. It's not on these charts, but it's a good thing. Something to consider.
But Joe, let me interject. So just to your question, the town is working on a wastewater plan for the
Yeah, I
town.
was just wondering whether that was assumed that the whole downtown is already on the wastewater plan.
Because we don't know yet what the timetable is for wastewater, but there is an active wastewater plan being developed for the town, which in this area, you would have sewer and you would have pumping stations. Because I'm aware of that for this area.
Okay, good. That makes sense.
Dry floodproofing is strategies to keep water storm surge out of the building, and they're only allowable for commercial and just non-residential uses, because they don't want to risk somebody being in a home that has some structural impact because of that load that's on the wall from the water. So these are for usually block construction rather than stick construction. They entail things like gates, door barriers, deployable barriers, window treatments. Some of them are actually windows that are floodproof, and some of them are sort of shields that go over your fenestrations. Building.
Do sandbags have a place in that?
They are a sort of a stopgap. Some of these things, these solutions are a little more,
Sophisticated?
yeah, a little more reliable. So sandbags, obviously, you can stack them and they mostly hold together, but you're always going to have some leakage. These are a little less prone to leakage.
So would you combine these with some of the previous slide things? Like if you moved everything up from the first floor and you were preparing the first floor to be flooded.
Yep.
You would do the dry flood proofing?
You wouldn't do dry flood proofing on a home.
No, in
But
business.
in a business, yep.
And then you would would move, the actual business would be up on the second or third floor.
Well, if you're doing dry floodproofing, you're assuming that you're keeping that first floor dry. So that's going to protect it. Yep. So there's a little bit of mix and match that you could do. If you have exterior building systems, you might want to elevate those and put some sort of dry floodproofing in if you want to protect that first floor usable space from flooding. If you have a space that can flood, then and it's not going to impact, maybe you have like a sort of a warehouse sort of situation, then you might want to think of like putting up your stock or whatever it is on higher shelves, but maybe it's a concrete floor and that's not a huge impact to the structure.
So I have another question. So a lot of people have generators now and condensers outside.
Yep.
On the ground. Are there any suggestions?
So that's on this third row. There are things you can do. The building systems, which would be elevating those pieces of equipment. Yep.
Elevate those.
Yep. If you have things like a sump pump, that would be good to get out, make sure that it's not going to get impacted by flooding, but it's also going to help you pump out your basement. If there are ways that maybe a drain could back up, you want to install a backflow preventer. And then there are small site scale things that you can also do to protect a structure, like a small vegetated berm, some deployable barriers. I have some better examples of that in the following slide, and landscape walls.
Wait, before you go on, back up in the second row, we skipped over the enhanced building envelope and what damage resistant materials.
So yeah, good point. So you can integrate materials into whatever portions of the building may flood that, maybe it's not carpet, right? It could be like more of a vinyl floor that could more easily get cleaned up and not have any like mold or anything like that. That's an example of that, and not using drywall, for example. Enhanced building envelope. There are some materials that are coming out now that you can actually have your window, for example, be a flood barrier. They're not cheap. Here's some examples of those things. So barrier panels can be deployed across a window, across a door, that can actually come out from a building if you have an area that you want to kind of protect in sort of like a vestibule arrangement. They can also be freestanding. You can kind of have 4 posts and connect them together in a square.
And that's only in commercial, not residential?
I believe you can use flood barrier panels no, actually, I think those are more commercial.
So when you say they're deployed, are they there all the time and you walk around them, or you put them in when the flood is coming?
The way that these are installed, there's sort of lags drilled into the wall that bolts connect to. And these panels, or whatever the material is, sometimes it's a fabric, get sort of put out in anticipation of a storm. Again, there's glass systems like windows and walls. I think that one on the far right is an example from Charleston, where they've started building their harbor walk with a wall that you can see through, but that also keeps storm surge out. There's drop-in systems, so there's sort of these planks or logs where you have posts that have slots, and those lock together. You just kind of keep stacking your logs up until you don't want, until the level that addresses the surge that you're targeting. And then
are the posts always installed?
the posts in this case, I think those are, there might be something on the ground that they install to, but I think those can be taken out as well. I'm pretty sure. Passive flood barriers are usually on bigger infrastructure projects. They're something that are either sort of installed in the ground or below the ground. And as water comes in, they fill up a chamber and raise that barrier. Here's some examples of those deployable barriers. Some of them are kept in place in like a box, and they can be deployed like a curtain across, and once they get weighted with a little bit of water, there's some initial leakage, and then they kind of self-seal. But those are kept in place. You just have to open and pull across. The perimeter flood barriers are more like gates that have to be stored somewhere. The ones on the left are sort of a vinyl material, so you can fold them up and roll them up. They also come as like fixed sort of plastic barrier, almost like a Jersey barrier kind of configuration. And then there are others that are filled with water. So those are bags that are filled with water. You have to have a water source, obviously, and you have to have a way of discharging that's permittable. So those aren't used as commonly. On the landscape scale, there's a variety of things you can consider. Some are more hardened infrastructure, and some are more nature-based. So things that are more engineered are elevated land and streets, walls and bulkheads and revetments, as well as levees. Breakwaters and surge barriers are in a much larger context. Breakwaters are more for reducing wave impacts, and we're already sort of behind the barrier of Town Neck Beach. So while we do get some waves in the Mill Creek wetland, that's maybe not something that needs to be considered because they're usually lower. There's less fetch.
Can I ask a question? At
Yeah.
the town beach, talking where we actually have a cement wall, I noticed that the water is coming around one end more and more now. It's eating into the dune on the side. Is there any plan to extend that?
On the
Towards
backs?
the east end, toward the canal?
Next to the brewery, next to the restaurant she's talking about.
Oh, like scour okay.
Seawall.
Okay, so there's work going on not related to this project for nourishment of Town Neck Beach and the Section 111 study, right, that's ongoing.
You have never, not you personally, but the town has never gotten sand down that far.
The plan though is to put sand.
Down that
Yeah,
far?
the overlay starts there and goes all the way down to the mountain.
Go the other way.
Yeah, it's gonna start there and go all the way down to the Old Creek Mountain.
Oh, that's
So sorry.
It's okay.
So Section 111 is, we are looking at the winter of 23-24, that being approved and having the canal dredged at the same time. So that would put all the entire 355,000 cubic yards of sand. And the overlay, if you go on our website, on the Natural Resources website, you'll see the plan. The overlay starts there, goes behind the brewery, all the way down, becomes a lot thicker when you get down to the big parking lot off of down at the end.
But have you noticed that
Oh,
the
yeah.
east end, that's why there's so much sand in the lot itself, it washed in.
Yeah, well, the idea of putting the dune back would be elevating it, bringing it out farther, bringing it down beyond where the breakwaters are there, so that if the impact of the waves would energy would dissipate, so that we wouldn't have as much movement of sand right there.
Right. Great.
Oh, is that good? So, which actually is a nice dovetail to the next section here, which is more of the nature-based infrastructure that can be used to help with storm surge. Elevated beaches and reconstructed dunes are one way of addressing some of these flooding issues. Maybe not as appropriate for interior parts of Sandwich Village, but you do benefit from Town Neck Beach and that barrier. Living shorelines are a way to get some elevation and also have a natural edge where we have sort of plantings integrated with some, usually it's like a core fiber and sometimes a rock sill at the bottom to kind of break up the wave energy, and then you get a little bit of elevation to address that flooding. Things like constructed wetlands, artificial reefs, floating islands, and breakwaters, those are more about reducing wave energy.
Just so I understand, if you manage somehow all of the entire coast, to get the coastline higher.
Yeah.
With this technique, the freshwater in our ponds isn't going to float on that saltwater and flood the interior?
I'm not sure if I understand your question.
Well, it's almost like you're creating a scene in Holland, you got a seawall all the way around, but we have freshwater ponds that float on the underlying seawater.
Yeah, so
Sea level comes out, don't the ponds come up too?
the groundwater intrusion is, and yeah, that is an issue. We're not proposing a big wall or berm around the whole.
This is just to take the energy out of the way.
Yeah. And the last two are sort of, well, the second to last line is kind of using the landscape at a larger scale to gain some elevation, but also get some beneficial public space. And then finally, if there's no other way, you can always move out of harm's way. So that's kind of the range of options of things to do on the landscape scale. How do you pay for it? I don't have all the answers, but we started to make a list. As I said, this is a grant that's funded by the state under the MVP Action Grant program. They fund infrastructure projects, building retrofits, as well as nature-based solutions, beach and dune nourishments, that sort of thing, same as the coastal zone management grants. They will provide funding to municipalities and to nonprofits who have publicly accessible properties. MVP actually will fund, as far as I can tell in my reading, they will fund residential and commercial work on residential and commercial properties. You have to have letters of support from the affected landowners, and I would assume that whatever work occurs on those private properties would have to have some public benefit. So they'd be probably addressing some larger flood pathway behind them. There's a lot of other grant programs that are focused on land conservation and making potentially vulnerable land more open space that is fine to flood. And then there are FEMA and Army Corps and Massachusetts programs focused on hazard mitigation, which have more of an infrastructure component to do flood proofing. Some will do work only on municipal or nonprofit properties, and others may integrate some private concerns as well. There are other ways to pay for this stuff too. There could be integrated into capital plans at the town level, bonds, identifying taxes and fees that could go into a fund. We've used CPC funds for that, to that effect as well. And then, paying for it on your own is another way to do it. It's something that has to be planned for, obviously. Okay, so having gone through the vulnerability assessment and all of this range of adaptation strategies, what we did for this project was thinking through all of those different places that are vulnerable in Sandwich Village and all the different strategies that may be available, sort of like what was that? The kind of laying out the menu of options, not necessarily recommending any one. The goal of this project was to sort of understand that vulnerability and lay out those short, medium, and long-term strategies, figuring out where and when, over what timelines they may be effective. And then eventually, this is the start of a conversation, we have these pathways mapped out, eventually starting to make some decisions about which strategies are the preferred ones for this area. So it sort of looks like this. You've got different actions that have a timeline and different, I'll get into this a little bit more detail later, but they have a certain lifetime of effectiveness. There's different types of strategies that are more infrastructure-based or nature-based. And we kind of like put them all out on a map, and eventually you may be able to pick a line through it and figuring out, you know, what makes sense to do over what timeline. Just to give you all a little more information, so all of the vulnerability assessment information that I talked about before is available on these web maps that are linked from the town's natural resource page. So if you go there and you click on the Coastal Resilience Story Map and scroll down, you can get into either of these three maps that ask, you know, there's a way to sort of give your feedback also here. So you can talk about what's important in Sandwich Village, look at all of the sea level rise and storm surge maps, and then start thinking about different strategies for adaptation. You can kind of zoom in and click on all the information that you want to check out. The other component that we tried to integrate here was community preference. So given our knowledge about what the flood projections are showing and what the range of options might be, we don't want to tell you what you should do. We want to hear from you in terms of what types of things you'd like to see, what types of things you value in the village. So we conducted a bunch of interviews, and we also had a survey. What we heard from interviews with town staff and business owners and residents was obviously Sandwich Village already experiences flooding. 6A, River Street, Willow Street, Jarvis, and the Boardwalk are experiencing more. And as you noted, groundwater is also becoming an issue. The fire station has had flooding in the past as well. Sandwich Village is sort of seen as the heart of the town, and that's why it's thought of as so important. It's where town hall is. It's historic buildings, has commercial activity, and it's a hub for tourism. And it's seen as sort of critical for adapting to sea level rise. I think the biggest message there is that everything should be on the table: protection, accommodating flooding, as well as retreat. We had a stakeholder survey online. We had a very large response, especially from year-round residents, from the town as well as the village. Many people have experienced, they use the village a lot, daily to 2 to 3 times a week. People said that the restaurants, walkability, use of municipal facilities, shopping, historic sites, those are all the things that brought them into the village. Other things that were mentioned maybe less often were exercise and recreation, the arts, fishing, temporary lodging, and permanent and living here. We asked people what was important about the village, and the 3 that really rose to the top were historic character, access to the outdoors, and the businesses. We also asked, considering sea level rise and considering storm surge, what types of strategies would you support? And what we found was there's an overwhelming preference for using nature-based solutions wherever that's possible, and basically a negative view or a last option of retreat. Makes sense. And somewhere in between is sort of engineered flood protection and elevation. We asked people, is there anything that's sort of could function elsewhere? Like if it was really vulnerable, could it still do the same thing if you had to move it away? And also, what else would we like to see in the village? Maybe there's an opportunity to dovetail some of the solutions with things that are desirable for the village. So what we heard from that was that many things could move if necessary. I think there's an overall preference not to move anything. But there was a strong preference to keep things that give the village its character the way they are as much as possible. So that historic vibe as much as possible to keep that in the village. Some of the other things that people would like to see for the village would be more businesses and attractions, increased accommodation for pedestrian and bicycle access, which, depending on what solution you're looking for, there may be some opportunities to align that with flood protection. And additional opportunities for outdoor recreation. So access to the outdoors was, something that people really like to see and want more of. So considering all of that, we developed 4 themes for these adaptation strategies. And they correspond to different colors on these maps and on these figures that you'll be looking at later. First one was maintain character. So sort of using incremental strategies like wet flood proofing and deployable solutions to kind of keep the existing character and structure the way it is, but be able to respond to some maybe lower level storms. Using nature to provide some flood protection and ecosystem services, and in many cases recreational benefits too. So those are things like living shorelines, salt marsh restoration. In other areas, it may be things like dunes and beach nourishment, but in the confines of Sandwich Village, that's not really something that we looked at. Protection of those assets using more engineered structures, and sometimes finding ways to integrate some natural features into it, but primarily using engineered solutions to provide protection. Those are things like seawalls and bulkheads, landscape berms and sort of terracing in the landscape scale, and elevating roads or using dry flood proofing in those.
What's the difference between a flood wall and a seawall and a bulkhead?
So a flood wall could be something that's away from the water. It'd be like freestanding in the landscape, but it could block flooding if and when necessary. And a seawall is right at the edge. So yeah, a seawall and a bulkhead is right at the edge. It drops right down to the water. And the final theme that we looked at was adaptive realignment. This is sort of like where it doesn't make sense to hold the line, pull either back or move up. So these are things like elevating buildings or infrastructure, changing the programming of those vulnerable floors, bottom floors, and then also undevelopment or retreat. maybe opportunities to pair that with, sort of provision of open space that provides flood protection. So all of these strategies are on maps which have a key, and I'll just explain that key to you. We have two different lines of sort of, is this adaptation effective? Is it effective for addressing storm flooding? Is it effective for addressing tidal flooding? A black box indicates that it is effective, and for a storm it would be effective at a 1% chance, sort of a 100-year storm. A gray box indicates that it has some flood protection to maybe a lower level storm. And a blank white box tells you that it's not effective at addressing that hazard. A cross through it tells you that you could do it now, you could do it at some timeline, but it might not be necessary because that asset isn't exposed to the flood risk, so it's not necessary to do then. Here's an example of those adaptation maps. So I'll just sort of go through the 4 maps for the River Street corridor. Using that maintain character theme, there are certain areas and timelines of effectiveness for things like wet flood proofing, elevating mechanical equipment, deployable barriers. Yeah, I think that covers it. There's different groupings based on their exposure. So there's different timelines based on basically their elevation, as well as what the assumed solution is, how high the floodproofing goes, how high the barriers go. In the River Street area, one thing we did look at on the east side of River Street was undeveloping an existing parking lot behind the town hall annex and allowing that low area to accommodate salt marsh migration over time. So it kind of removes a vulnerable area from storm surge. It doesn't put developed parking lot or cars in harm's way, and it allows nature to progress as climate change evolves. For protect and connect strategies, we looked at some different places for elevating roads, putting out some landscape berms, dry flood proofing, and then on River Street itself, the possibility of elevating that road and increasing the size of the culvert to allow more water to get through and underneath. So you have a higher road and more throughput underneath of it. So as you go through and check out all these maps, there's descriptions under each adaptation, and then there's a timeline. So you can read a little bit more and talk about its effectiveness. And then finally, for realignment, some of the things we considered were elevating some of the low-lying homes on pilings. Obviously, that has a limited time span if you're thinking about long-term tidal flooding. So if you have a building that's up high, it doesn't really work for you if you can't get to it in the first place because of sea level rise. Another thing we looked at was sort of avoiding that vulnerable low spot on River Street by basically daylighting that stream, by daylighting Mill Creek and having River Street dead end on either side of it. So just avoid the crossing and just have access to homes on either side. So right now it's in a culvert. So opening it up. Yeah. All of those strategies are keyed into these pathways, and the timeline kind of reflects sort of the timeline that we were talking about on the maps. Effectiveness for addressing a 1% surge level over time is a solid, thick solid line. Effectiveness at addressing lower level storms is a thick dotted line, and effectiveness at addressing tidal inundation is a thin dotted line. And there will be little nodes or stops in these charts. A circle means basically a decision point. You can decide to do something else for that asset at any point until it doesn't make sense, in which case you have a line, a straight line, which indicates a tipping point. An example of that would be, like I just mentioned, where you may have elevated your home on pilings, but you can't get to it because the road, either the road is flooded or the driveway and yard is inundated.
Do you have a time in the model when the sea level doesn't rise anymore? Or just it keeps rising for 300 years?
Well, we don't go out 300 years, but
no, but you're aware of the models, right?
Yeah,
I think they say it does go out.
it does.
Several hundred years.
Yeah, I mean the uncertainty on those timelines is very large.
They're getting more certain.
They are, but when you go out, like I would say the next 50 years is pretty well known. Beyond that, there's a lot of uncertainty.
There's no model that says it stops, right?
Not that I'm aware of. Until there's no more ice left. Until there's no more ice left, which is centuries probably. But these models are going out to 2070. I mean, there's sea level rise projections beyond that, but for infrastructure planning and community planning, we're going out to sort of 2070 and 2100. So here's just an example of those charts. There's different colors and different bars that, as I said, indicate different effectiveness. There's keys at every station so that you can remind yourself what this all means. And the timelines are tied into different quantities of elevations of sea level rise. And those may have different timelines based on how climate change plays out and how emissions play out as well. Again, some uncertainty in that. So what could be projected as a 2050 might actually be happening in 2070. We just don't know for certain yet. But that's sort of like the range of timelines. One thing to note on this one, you'll see like there's a blue line for that River Street option at the bottom there. I kind of highlighted that in green because not only is it sort of getting out of harm's way by pulling the road back, but there may also be some nature-based benefits there because you're allowing more tidal exchange to go up the river. There may be some salt marsh restoration that occurs above. So that's kind of a dual purpose pathway. So maybe just to clarify, this chart corresponds to actions for the lower portions of River Street. So lower elevations, you'll notice the timelines don't go out as far. There's less solid bars that address high level storms. This one is for the upper portions of River Street and Main Street. So there's higher ground, basically. They're dealing with less vulnerability. So we have the maps and the charts, and what we're asking you to do is go to wherever you're interested in looking at solutions and look at the timelines, look at the strategies, and tell us what you think. So at each table, there will be a pile of sheets, and they correspond to the strategies that are on the pathways charts. If you'd like, you can leave your name. We would like to know if you're a resident of that area or a business owner in that area. And if you have any, do you think it's good, okay, or bad in terms of your of the acceptability of that idea. Do you have any comments on it? And certainly if you have other things that you'd like to add, other strategies that we should consider, definitely write those down here too. So there are 3 sort of planning areas that we've broken the village out into. There's a River Street corridor, which, as I said, has that lower area along Mill Creek, and then the upper area that kind of hugs Tupper Road and Main Street. That's that bright green at the bottom. There's Tupper Road and 6A corridor, which is that northern yellow area. That kind of goes along Tupper Road up to the intersection of 6A and then down to the Mill Creek Bridge. And there are 2 kind of sub areas there that address Tupper Road as well as that commercial corridor on 6A. And then finally, Jarvis Street and 6A corridor, which addresses that southeast segment of the study area that includes the southern part of 6A to Jarvis Street, as well as that Willow Street area. And then finally, all 3 of those stations are in the room next door. And we also have a couple potential ideas for regional solutions. So for the whole study area, the whole alignment, what are things that could possibly address flooding for Sandwich Village? Those are in that corner.
Can you point where the new town hall is?
Yeah.
I'm thinking I see it, but
It is.
yeah, okay, yeah. Thank you. Can you say a little bit about berms and building up berms or vegetating berms? That's
Sure.
one of the things that's mentioned. And that, on the face of it, for someone who knows nothing about this kind of stuff, seems like such a great solution.
If you have enough space to do it, if you're not impacting a resource area, it can be a great solution. It's sort of elevating land to some level that helps you maybe not solve every storm and extreme storm, but it can block flooding. You know, if you're going up a 3-foot berm, probably doesn't take up much space. If you're talking like a 6-foot to 8-foot target threshold that you need to be addressing for flooding, that berm is going to take up a lot of space because of the slopes that you'd have to deal with. But essentially, it's land on a mound. You can plant it, terrace it. It can be.
You should call it that. Right? I mean, your model is not 8-foot sea level. You should call it a dike. It's not.
Well, I guess I'm just wondering why, you know, all through Mill Creek and the marsh, there are areas that are underwater at high tide and clearly not at low tide. And why couldn't some of that land be raised, slowed down, you know, added to, whether it was, I don't mean like one straight thing, but you know, there are all these different little.
Yep.
Why couldn't we build those up as berms to slow down the intake of water?
One, that's engineering wise, that's probably possible. The thing that you have to be concerned with is permitting and cost, yeah, and the environment. So you can't fill in a wetland. There's also issues with filling in a floodplain area in terms of redirecting flow in some other way that's not desirable.
But isn't that kind of the idea, is to redirect the flow and to slow it down?
It is. You just don't want to have it have unintended consequences on your neighbors. Yeah. So it's just.
Right. Yeah. I'm not talking about residential. I'm talking about like to protect 6A. Let's say that area with the firehouse.
Uh-huh.
Like, why not slow down some of that water that's coming in by building up some of those areas that are dry land when it gets low tide?
Yes. Yeah. If it's an upland area, then you could definitely raise that area.
So that that dry land there's more dry land at high tide, not just at low tide.
Right.
And slow down the inundation.
Yeah, as long as it's not an existing wetland, that is a possibility.
You'll see that on some of the maps. It's one of our options is to raise some of the land behind the fire station and things like that.
So what would happen, have you studied what would happen if you put a Providence, Rhode Island style barrier at Mill Creek at the railroad track and raised the railroad track a couple, 3 feet to hold that water from coming into town and then move the barrier?
We didn't study it. Like you'd have to put it into a model and figure out what happens to all that water in terms of where that goes. But that's a potential idea. It's on something like that is on those maps in the back corner.
And one other question, the January 6, 2018, was like a 12-foot high tide and a storm surge.
Yes.
I have asked this question multiple times, nobody's got the answer. What was the total amount, the depth of the 12 feet high tide? What was the storm surge on top of that? Because that was the highest we've ever seen.
I think I can look that up for you. I don't have it on my fingertips.
Well, that's what some people, I mean, I don't have anybody who's actually got real numbers.
Yeah, after when we break out, I'll look that up for you.
Okay.
Sure.
So you didn't look at any management treatment, relocate now to high ground?
No, there is some of that. And yeah. I just gave one example of one area. I think you probably could do some retreat in the lower portions of Mill Street over time, River Street over time. I'm not sure if that made it onto the map, but if it didn't, then certainly make a note of it for us. Okay.
I would think that retreat would be a very unpopular option.
It is. It is.
So, but these are buildings that have been there for a very long time, 50 years, a small amount of time on that scale. And 100 years from now, we know it certainly there'll be even more rise. So if you do want to preserve those buildings, I think your only choice is to move.
But it
So
actually
it's
moves the
just a waste of
buildings.
money. It's a waste of money to try to protect it for a little while. Eventually, you're going to move it. So move it.
That is something to consider.
Management treat is the answer for the nation. It's just, you're not going to keep out an ocean that's coming up.
Mother Nature has her way.
Even the Netherlands is breaking down the dikes and giving up. It's just move up to high land. So you'd like to see a plan, look what it looks like.
Sure.
Yeah, but for those of us who live down there, it isn't quite that easy.
Nobody, sure, right, I understand. The emotional thought. We moved one town like New Orleans, a huge amount of money to a small village. And nobody liked it. It was a terrible thought. Water it's hard to stop.
Oh, I know. I just hope I'm dead.
So certainly put all of that feedback and those ideas on some of these sheets. I think what we'll do now is, well, I'll briefly touch on what else we're doing for this project, and then we can break out and talk about and kind of explore all of these things. Some of the other things that we're doing for this grant are developing a business resilience handbook to look at some of these strategies, how they might be playing out for businesses in the village. Different sort of typologies, like what could a restaurant do, what could an inn do, what could a retail store do, that sort of thing. We are developing some renderings of some of these adaptation strategies, primarily one for Tupper Road, one for that town hall annex parking lot that I talked about, pulling out the parking lot and allowing salt marsh migration. And then one behind the police and fire station, which is sort of about, open space and providing some protective feature that's integrated into a landscape. Our final report is due at the end of this month, and then we'll be scheduling a select board meeting to present the final results. So with that, I'll invite you all to, maybe I'll keep this up so you can remind yourselves about the different areas. Again, regional strategies are in that back corner there, and then the three sub areas are in the adjacent room. And Brittany and Dave and I will be around to answer questions.
Do you also want to, since we're being recorded, do you want to mention about this being
available? Oh, yeah, thank you. So all of these materials will also be available at Town Hall after this meeting. We'll probably take a couple days to set them up, but the maps and pathway diagrams and the feedback forms will be available for anybody who couldn't make it, or if you want a second crack at it.
So I just have one last question. I have looked online at the different maps, and I was unclear. Are they supposed to be like interactive? You can click on something and something changes?
If you pull up, I can show you after we break. If you pull up the legend, or not the legend, but there's another tray that allows you to select different layers. You can turn on different.
I was able to turn the layers on, but okay. Going down your legend, you can't click on the legend and have it light up on the.
No, you have to, yeah.
And I'm not sure this is a question for you, but and I guess I'm thinking more of Sandwich and residents, and that fewer than 300 responded to your survey. And then the percentage of that, the general population of Sandwich. Mm-hmm. So I guess the people here, right, so not reflective, is what's the Sandwich itself making an effort to engage more of its citizens to understand the impact? And I mean, because I guess I'm concerned about communications outreach to the general Sandwich residents.
So
how is that? I'm sure that's not your.
Sure, go ahead.
It's not. So as part of, because this is just the beginning, trying to get people educated. And so as part of this grant, what we did was we looked at a little bit different way to get the communication out. So it's not just through the typical means of the town website or our website or the newspaper, although we're very happy that the enterprise is here. Thank you.
That's how we do it. I could not find anything about it anywhere except in the enterprise.
So the other avenues that we looked at is going through the Chamber of Commerce to get out to all their membership, going through the Council on Aging, going through Heritage, and we're trying to build these avenues of communication. Because obviously you see, I would love to have 300 people here. I've done probably 4 of these over the last 5 years, and the most well-attended one had about 30 people in. So we're trying, and again, if you've got ideas that we haven't tried yet, more
than the tax rolls, because you can email your taxes, right? You get emails about them. Why can't you email everybody who's on the tax?
I did get an email
about this.
Yeah.
You get an email if you're signed up for the alert through the selectman's office. Yeah, but you have to be signed up for it the way our website works. And so.
Right. That's only twice a year.
But, and again, we're looking for ideas. This is the beginning, you know, because the conversation has to start. And things like managed retreat that people really, it's a hard decision for people. And so this whole idea was starting the conversation, starting the education with the public, letting people know really what's coming up with strategies that are short-term, mid-term, and long-term. Because the short and the mid-term are going to help us with some of the long-term strategies. Retreat at some point, yeah, but how do we do that? You know, and for people who live right down at the water's edge, that's really not available to them right now. So we have to look at it holistically. I'm sorry, I cut you off.
No, thank you for that. And so the timeline of when, you know, the communications, education, understanding the options, etc., to the decision of what are we going to do, how are we spending this grant money? What is our timeline?
So the
grant money is spent. Okay, spent.
So the next one
would be
potentially be exploring some of this further, implementing something, or exploring another area.
Okay, and the timeline for that?
Is the next several years, because we're trying to get this on the decision makers' agenda.
So this is very new.
Exactly.
This is a
Yeah.
So we're talking 5 to 10 years
Yes.
in the sense of anything happening.
Yeah, except maybe some of the short-term strategies. Because I've already talked to, for example, the fire chief is very much on board with doing some of the barriers, some of the things, getting the booklet out for strategies, which can be adapted for residents as well as businesses for flood-proof, and getting that out right away, getting the education out right away. But as far as the decisions, I wish I made the decision.
Thank you, that's it.
Okay. Well, I guess we'll break and we'll be around to answer questions as you check things out. There's a box right next to the sign-in sheet for your feedback forms. So please leave those when you're through.